Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are plunging into the life and reign of, well, one of history's most compelling figures, Catherine the Great.
Absolutely, a fascinating woman.
Born Princess Sophie of Anhalt-Zerbst, her journey to becoming Empress of Russia from 1762 to 1796, it fundamentally reshaped the Russian Empire.
It really did. A huge impact.
Our mission in this deep dive, and we're drawing from the sources you shared, is to sort of unpack the key aspects of her life, revealing maybe surprising facts and some insights into how she left such an indelible mark on Russia.
Sounds good. Where should we start?
Let's get started right at the beginning.
Okay. Well, Catherine's story, it grips you right from the start. Born in Stettin, Prussia, which is now part of Poland, back in 1729.
Right.
And her family's financial situation was, well, perhaps less opulent than you might imagine for a future empress.
Oh, really?
Yeah, her father, Prince Christian August of Anhalt-Zerbst, who was a Prussian general, and her mother, Joanna Elizabeth of Holstein-Gottorp, came from noble stock, definitely. But their resources were, let's just say, not unlimited. Okay, let's unpack that. Limited finances for a princess. That sort of challenges the usual image, doesn't it?
It does.
Do you think maybe this relative lack of, initial wealth might have played a role in her later drive, her incredible resourcefulness as empress?
It's certainly possible. Maybe gave her a certain grit. And it's also fascinating about those Swedish connections.
Yeah, tell me about those.
Her mother's brother became the heir to the Swedish throne, and two of her cousins, Gustav III and Charles III, they later became kings of Sweden.
Wow, so it paints a picture of a family with, significant international ties, even if they weren't exactly swimming in cash immediately.
Precisely. These connections, they really underscore the intricate network of European royalty and, the crucial role of strategic marriages for these smaller German principalities like Sophie's.
So she was basically groomed for this.
Oh, yeah. Prepared from a young age for just such a union. Her education reflects this primarily through a French governess and tutors.
French, of course. The language of the elite back then. Exactly, she mastered it. And, surprisingly, she was even described as a bit of a tomboy. Like sword training, apparently.
A sword-wielding tomboy princess.
Yeah. Yet in her own recollections, she called her childhood uneventful.
Uneventful. With sword training, that's quite a contrast. And then comes that pivotal moment, meeting her future husband, Peter.
Right. Her second cousin, the future Peter III, met him in 1739. She was only 10.
10 years old. And it wasn't exactly love at first sight, I gather.
Far from it. She reportedly found him quite disagreeable, took an immediate dislike, apparently, to his pale complexion and his fondness for, well, alcohol even then.
Ooh, not a great start.
No. And this initial aversion, it really sets the stage for their deeply troubled relationship later on.
So the marriage itself in 1745 was purely political.
Fundamentally, driven by political aims, Prussia wanted to strengthen its ties with Russia, weaken Austrian influence.
And undermined Chancellor Biskup of Reuman.
Exactly. He favored Austria. Sophie's mother, Joanna Elizabeth, played a pretty big role in all this maneuvering. Though her, let's say, persistent interference eventually got her banished from Russia by Empress Elizabeth.
Got herself kicked out.
Yep. So this wasn't just, two families getting along. It was a big strategic move on the European chessboard, trying to shift power away from Austria.
Right. So a marriage based on strategy, an unliked groom, a meddling mother who gets banished. Hardly a recipe for happiness.
Not at all.
But Sophie, or Catherine as she'd become, was apparently remarkably good at handling difficult situations.
Oh, absolutely. Her arrival in Russia, she was 15, marked the beginning of this really deliberate, determined effort to, well, fit in, to ingratiate herself with the Russian court.
How did she do that?
Well, first she applied herself to learning Russian, really diligently, studying late into the night, apparently.
That shows commitment.
It does. And then, when she fell seriously ill pneumonia, pleuritis her choice to seek comfort from an Orthodox clergyman rather than a Lutheran pastor. That was huge.
Ugh. Politically savvy, even when sick.
Extremely. It really boosted her popularity with Empress Elizabeth and the court. And that paved the way for her conversion to Orthodox Christianity.
And that's when she took the name Catherine.
Exactly. Catherine and the patronymic Alexievna.
Yeah.
Deliberately linking herself to Catherine I, Peter the Great's wife. Very clever.
Very clever indeed. It really highlights her sharp political mind, even that young. So the marriage to Peter finally happens in 1745, notably without her father there.
Correct. He didn't attend.
And that kicked off what sounds like a profoundly unhappy union, their life at Oranienbaum. Not great.
No, not harmonious at all. The marriage wasn't even consummated for years, apparently because of Peter's immaturity.
Really? Wow.
Yeah. He eventually took a mistress, and Catherine, well, in response, she became involved with other influential figures at court.
So affairs on both sides.
Seems like it. But this period of personal unhappiness, ironically, it sort of became a catalyst for her intellectual growth.
Oh.
She became a voracious reader, just devoured books, especially the French Enlightenment philosophes Voltaire, Montesquieu.
Thinkers focused on reason, rights, reform.
Exactly. The stuff that heavily influenced her later, and also the historian Tacitus.
Tacitus, Roman historian. What did she get from him?
Well, his emphasis on hidden motives, power politics, seems to have really resonated with her. You can see it in her shrewd political moves later, how she calculated and cultivated allies.
Okay, so while her marriage was a mess, it actually sharpened her political thinking. Interesting.
Very. And amidst all this, children were born, or at least appeared.
Right, the paternity questions. Paul the First.
Exactly. Officially Peter's son, but there's speculation, even hints in Catherine's own early memoirs about Sergei Saltykov being the father.
And then there was Anna.
Yes, born and tragically died young. Peter openly questioned if she was his. And then, of course, her illegitimate son, Alexei Bobrinsky, with Grigory Orlov.
Grigory Orlov. He becomes important later, doesn't he?
Very important. So yeah, the Iranian bomb years, a real hotbed of intrigue, shifting loyalties, personal drama, and intellectual development.
It really set the stage for everything that came next.
Precisely. This complex web of relationships and court politics laid the groundwork for her, well, dramatic rise to power.
Because Peter III's reign as emperor didn't last long, did it?
Very brief.
Ah.
And deeply unpopular. He became emperor in January 1762 after Empress Elizabeth died, moved the court to the new Winter Palace.
But his actions quickly alienated people.
Massively. His eccentric behavior and his unwavering pro-Prussian policies, they just rubbed the nobility and the military completely the wrong way.
That admiration for Frederick II of Prussia, ending the war with Prussia, planning to partition Poland.
All hugely unpopular moves, flew in the face of Russian interests.
Yeah.
And then the conflict with Denmark over Schleswig because of his family ties.
It sounds like he was actively undermining everything his predecessors had built.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah.
It created a huge amount of resentment very quickly.
And Catherine, meanwhile, wasn't just sitting idly by.
Not at all. She was strategically building her own network, cultivating allies, waiting for her moment, perhaps.
And that moment came in July 1762.
It did. The arrest of one of her co-conspirators basically triggered the coup d'etat.
And she acted decisively.
Incredibly so. Her speech to the Ismailovsky regiment, rallying them to her side, getting the clergy to accept her as the sole ruler, it was a remarkable piece of political theater, executed perfectly.
An incredibly bold move, seizing power like that.
Extremely bold. And fast.
And the outcome for Peter III, well, it wasn't good.
No. Swift and irreversible, he was forced to abdicate, died shortly after in Rapture. Officially, the circumstances were mysterious.
But the suspicion is assassination, right? By Alexei Orlov, Grigory's brother.
That's the strong suspicion, yes. The official cause, severe hemorrhoidal colic and an apoplexy stroke. Well, historians tend to view that with some skepticism.
Understandable. Were there other rivals she had to worry about?
Oh, yes. The throne wasn't automatically secure. There was Ivan VI had been imprisoned since infancy.
Right, the tragic child emperor.
Exactly. And later assassinated during Catherine's reign to prevent any rescue attempts. And then there was the mysterious Princess Tarakanova, a pretender. It highlights how unstable things could be.
And Catherine's own legitimacy was even questioned, wasn't it, since she wasn't born Romanov?
Correct. Though she could claim ancestry back to the Rurik dynasty, the founders of Russes, and she cited the precedent of Catherine I, Peter the Great's wife, who also wasn't born royal, but ruled as empress.
So there was a precedent, but still debated. Regent or usurper?
Historians still discuss it. But regardless, she held on to that power firmly.
Okay, so she seized power. Now begins the reign of Catherine II, the coronation in Moscow, September 1762. Must have been quite something.
A grand spectacle, absolutely, and marked by the creation of the great imperial crown of Russia. A stunning piece, a real symbol of Romanov power.
A powerful statement right from the start.
Indeed. And from that point on, her focus really shifted to the immense task of governing this vast empire and expanding it. Her foreign policy was incredibly ambitious.
And largely successful, wasn't it? Russia expanded massively under her rule.
Astonishingly so, by about 520,000 square kilometers. huge territories like New Russia, Crimea, parts of the North Caucasus, right bank Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Courland,
Mostly at the expense of.
primarily the Ottoman Empire and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth.
And she had key people helping her execute this, foreign ministers.
Yes, figures like Nikita Panin initially with his Northern Accord idea and later Ivan Osterman, they were crucial.
And her relationship with Britain. I know they had a commercial treaty.
They did, but she was also quite wary of Britain's growing global power. A cautious relationship, you could say.
The big conflicts were with the Ottoman Empire, though, the Russo-Turkish Wars.
Those were central, yes. Two major wars, 1768, 1774, and 1787, 1792, generally resulted in significant Russian victories.
Which gave Russia access to the Black Sea.
Crucial access. Led to the annexation of Crimea in 1783, which was huge, and the establishment of vital new port cities in the south, Odessa, Nikolaev, Kherson, Sevastopol.
And the Treaty of Kusak-Kainarka. That was important, right?
Hugely important. Signed in 1774, Russia gained territory, free passage for its merchant ships through the Turkish Straits into the Mediterranean.
And that role as protector of Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman Empire.
Highly symbolic, and a useful diplomatic lever for Russia later on.
Then there was the war with Persia in 1796. What was that about?
A bit less conclusive. Driven partly by the Treaty of Georgievsk, where Russia promised protection to the Kingdom of Georgia, there was maybe also a desire to destabilize the Persian Shah. Russian forces took several cities.
But it fizzled out.
Catherine died suddenly, and her successor, her son Paul I, immediately recalled the troops.
Right. And in Western Europe, she wasn't just focused east and south.
No, she played a role there too. Positioned Russia as a mediator, like in the War of the Bavarian Succession, and she established the League of Armed Neutrality during the American Revolutionary War.
Ah, the League of Armed Neutrality. So this was basically neutral countries protecting their shipping rights against, well, primarily the British Navy.
Exactly. It was a way for neutral powers like Russia, Sweden, Denmark to protect their trade during that conflict. And Russia taking the lead really showed Catherine's ambition to project Russian power onto the wider European stage, challenging British dominance at sea.
Made sense, but probably the most controversial part of her foreign policy, the partitions of Poland.
Definitely the most controversial and arguably the most significant in terms of changing the map of Europe. 3 partitions, 1772, 1793, and 1795.
And while the initial idea might have come from Frederick II of Prussia,
Catherine played an absolutely central role. She'd put her former lover, Stanislaus Poniatowski, on the Polish throne, supported confederations that weakened Poland. Ultimately, she worked with Prussia and Austria to completely carve up the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Poland literally disappeared from the map as an independent state for over a century.
a brutal piece of realpolitik.
Absolutely. And her relations with China weren't great either, were they?
No, quite tense under the Qianlong Emperor. Disputes over the Treaty of Kakta, issues with Dzungar Mongol refugees fleeing into Russia. Catherine apparently had a pretty negative view of the emperor.
And attempts to open trade with Japan didn't really get anywhere initially. A shipwrecked merchant, Daikakuyakude, got back eventually, but Adam Laxman's trade mission failed.
So a very active foreign policy, lots of expansion, but not without criticism, even from her own grandson.
Right. Nicholas I, much later, gave a pretty critical assessment, called her policy dishonest, lacking long-term strategy. He pointed specifically to the Polish partitions, saying they ultimately damaged Russia's reputation and even its economy, contributing to things like famines.
That's a fascinating counterpoint, provides a different lens.
It does. It shows the complexity of evaluating her legacy. Now, shifting to economics, Russia at the time was, well, lagging behind Western Europe.
How so?
Limited free peasantry, relatively small middle class. Industry was emerging, but heavily reliant on serf labor.
Serfdom, the dominant feature of Russian society.
Absolutely. Catherine's attempts at state regulation of merchants mostly didn't work out.
But the Volga Germans, that was a success.
That was significantly more successful, yes. Her policy of encouraging their immigration brought in skilled farmers and artisans, helped modernize agriculture in those regions where they settled.
And what about money? Paper money started under her.
Yes, the Assignation Bank was established in 1768, introduced the first government paper money, the assignation ruble, driven largely by a shortage of silver and the need to finance wars.
Made sense. And financial reforms, trying to get a handle on the state's finances.
Some progress there. Under Prince Vyazemsky, there was an effort towards more centralized control, developing what you might call the first real approximation of a state budget.
Okay. And public health, you mentioned she focused on that too.
She did. It was a priority. Inspired partly by Enlightenment ideas, but also building on some Russian precedents. She launched the Moscow Foundling Home, a big orphanage and hospital complex.
Also, a lying-in hospital, Paul's Hospital,
Yeah.
collecting statistics.
Upgrading Army medical services, centralizing medical administration. Yes, she took it seriously.
And the smallpox inoculation, that was a big deal, wasn't it? Her getting inoculated herself.
A huge deal, very public. She and her son Pavel were inoculated by an English doctor, Thomas Dimsdale. It was a courageous act back then, quite risky.
And she promoted it throughout the empire.
Actively. It's estimated maybe 2 million people were inoculated by 1800, largely thanks to her example and promotion. A major public health campaign for its time.
Really underscores her commitment, even if 2 million was still a small fraction of the population. Okay,
Yeah.
now, let's tackle the really difficult issue. The serfs.
Right. The vast, vast majority of the population. Bound to the land, owned either by nobles or the state itself. Catherine personally owned something like 500,000 serfs.
500,000. And they weren't technically slaves, but
Their rights were extremely limited. Bound to the land, couldn't leave without permission, could be bought and sold with the land. Not quite chattel slavery like in the Americas, but a brutal system of bondage.
did things change for them under Catherine? For better or worse?
It's complex. On one hand, she did introduce the right for serfs to file complaints against nobles, but only through specific legal channels. They lost the right to petition her directly, which was a significant blow.
So a bureaucratic process instead of direct appeal.
Exactly. And nobles actually gained more power over their serfs in some ways, like the power to sentence them to hard labor in Siberia without going through state courts.
Wow, that's harsh.
Very harsh. She also tried to limit the spread of serfdom into new territories with a manifesto in 1775, but the overall trend wasn't really towards improvement for most serfs.
So the historical view of her as this enlightened ruler, it clashes hard with the reality of serfdom.
It absolutely does. And the serfs themselves, their discontent was growing. Restrictions, crop failures, epidemics, and then stricter rule from nobles after 1767. It all built up.
Leading to Pugachev's rebellion in 1774.
Exactly. A massive, violent uprising, led by a Cossack who claimed to be Peter III, who had somehow survived. It spread like wildfire.
Shows the level of desperation and anger, doesn't it?
Absolutely. Widespread violence, support for the pretender. It really shook the empire to its core.
And how did Catherine react once it was suppressed?
The brutally suppressed, of course. But the experience seems to have really reinforced her reluctance to even think about liberating the serfs. It scared her, made her double down on maintaining control and the existing order.
So, despite her Enlightenment readings, fundamental reform of serfdom was off the table after Pugachev.
Pretty much. The institution remained the bedrock of the Russian state throughout her reign. And the lives of serfs generally remained incredibly difficult.
Such a stark contrast. Because in other areas, like arts and culture, she was this huge patron, right?
Oh, absolutely. A true champion of what we call the Russian Enlightenment, the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg. It started as her personal art collection.
Right, filled with paintings, gems, books.
An incredible collection. And she really embraced Western European trends. English landscape gardens like at Tsarskoye Selo. Chinoiserie, that fashion for Chinese-inspired art and architecture. You see it in the Chinese palace at Oranienbaum, the Chinese village at Tsarskoye Selo.
And she actively engaged with intellectuals, the big names of the Enlightenment.
Definitely. Her correspondence with Voltaire lasted 15 years. She even bought his entire library after he died.
Wow. And Diderot, didn't she invite him to finish the encyclopedia in Russia?
She did. He visited. She supported him financially. She also brought top scientists to Russia, Leonhard Euler, Peter Simon Pallas. She really valued intellectual exchange.
What about the Grand Commission of 1766? Was that part of this Enlightenment push?
Sort of. It was meant to be this consultative body, representatives from different social groups, to discuss the empire's needs and maybe create a new legal code based on Enlightenment principles. She wrote the nakaz, or instructions for it, drawing heavily on Montesquieu and Beccaria.
But it didn't achieve much in the end.
No. He got bogged down in disagreements. The nobles weren't keen on giving up privileges, and many of the ideas were maybe too radical. It dissolved without producing the new code.
But there were still significant legislative reforms during her reign.
Oh, yes. Things like the Statute for the Administration of the Provinces in 1775, which reorganized local government, the Charter to the Nobility in 1785, which confirmed their rights and privileges, the Charter of the Towns, also 1785, various codes for commerce, police ordinances.
So efforts to modernize and streamline administration, even if they often reinforce the nobility's power.
Exactly. And she supported Russian arts and literature, too. Patrons of writers like Dershoven and von Weisen. She loved Russian opera.
But she also cracked down sometimes, like with Radishev.
Right. Alexander Radishev's book, Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, was deeply critical of serfdom and the autocracy. Catherine saw it as dangerously radical, especially after the French Revolution, and had him arrested and exiled.
Right.
Shows the limits of her tolerance.
A real paradox there. And artists painted her. We have descriptions.
Yes. Elizabeth Vigée-Lebrun painted her towards the end of her life and left a vivid written description. And Catherine's reign also saw the founding of the Moscow State Academy of Choreography, the future Bolshoi Ballet Academy in 1773. So a real flourishing of arts, but within certain boundaries.
And education, another key area for her.
Very much so. She believed education, especially European-style education, could create a new kind of person, modernize Russia.
Who advised her on this?
Ivan Betskoy was a key advisor. They set up commissions, studied practices elsewhere, consulted British educators.
What was the core idea?
The general program for the education of young people emphasized raising children in isolation, away from the supposedly backward influences of traditional Russian life.
Isolation, that sounds intense.
It was. The Moscow Foundling Home was partly an experiment for these ideas, but it struggled, especially with high mortality rates.
But the Smolny Institute for Noble Maidens, that was more successful.
Yes, quite influential. The first state-funded higher education place for women in Europe, actually, focused on French, music, dance, but very strict, very isolated.
What about a wider national school system?
Progress was slow initially. Later, under Pyotr Zavadovsky, a commission of national schools was set up. They established a national network, trained teachers, created textbooks. The Russian Statute of National Education in 1786 aimed for a two-tier system of free co-ed schools for the non-serf classes.
Ambitious. Did it work?
While funding was always a problem, and the response was patchy, many nobles still preferred private tutors or institutions. By the end of her reign, maybe 60,000-odd pupils were in these state schools. Significant, but still a tiny percentage of the whole population.
So, good intentions, some progress, but limited reach. Okay, let's turn to religion. Her personal beliefs versus her policies.
It's interesting. She embraced Russian Orthodoxy publicly, for political necessity, really, but personally. It seems she was somewhat indifferent, maybe even skeptical, more influenced by Enlightenment deism, perhaps.
And her policies towards the Orthodox Church.
Quite pragmatic and aimed at state control. The biggest move was nationalizing church lands early in her reign. This made the clergy financially dependent on the state. Monasteries were closed, their numbers drastically reduced.
So weakening the church as an independent power center.
Definitely. The clergy became essentially state employees, and their role in government was very limited. They weren't even represented in that Grand Commission.
What about other Christians? Old believers? Catholics?
She allowed old believers, who'd split from the official church centuries before, to practice more openly, at least initially, though many were later deported. With Catholics, especially after the partitions of Poland brought many into the empire, she maintained strict state control, appointed bishops, but paradoxically also gave refuge to the Jesuits when they were suppressed elsewhere in Europe.
Strange mix. And Islam. Russia was expanding into Muslim areas.
Her approach there was generally cautious, avoided forced conversion, used persuasion, money, integration, allowed mosques, set up state-controlled Muslim spiritual assemblies like in Orenburg, even subsidized new mosques and integrated Islamic schools into the public system later on. But there were restrictions too, like prohibiting Muslims from owning Orthodox serfs, creating pressure to convert.
So toleration, but managed toleration, aimed at control and integration.
That seems fair. Judaism was treated very differently, though.
How so?
Before the partitions of Poland, there weren't many Jews in Russia. The partitions brought in a huge Jewish population. Catherine confined them to the Pale of Settlement in the western provinces. They faced extra taxes, restrictions on movement and professions.
The Pale of Settlement, that lasted for a long time, didn't it?
Until the revolution, yes.
Oh.
She did try to integrate some into the economy via the Charter of the Towns, but then banned them from Moscow's middle class. Declared them foreigners in 1785, denied them rights of Orthodox citizens, doubled their taxes again in 1794. It was a policy of segregation and discrimination.
A very different approach than towards Muslims.
Completely different. It laid the foundation for centuries of difficulty for Russia's Jewish population.
Okay, shifting gears again. Her personal life. Famously colorful.
Extremely. Numerous lovers, or favorites, she often elevated them to high positions, gave them immense wealth, land, titles, thousands of serfs.
Which must have cost the state a fortune.
Undoubtedly. Spending on the court definitely increased. Gifts were lavish. Grigory Potemkin was the most significant, of course.
Katumkin. Lover, advisor, maybe even secret husband.
The secret husband part is debated, probably unlikely. But their relationship was incredibly close and influential. Long after the romantic affair ended around 1776, he remained her closest advisor and arguably the most powerful man in Russia.
And he allegedly helped pick her subsequent lovers.
That's the story, yes. To ensure they wouldn't challenge his own position. Her generosity to former lovers was legendary, though. They were usually pensioned off comfortably. Her last favorite, Platon Zubov, was much younger than her.
How was her being a powerful woman ruler viewed at the time?
Within Russia, her authority as empress, once established, was generally accepted. There was precedent. But in Western Europe, there was definitely some fascination, maybe skepticism. Commentators often focused on her lovers, sometimes portraying her negatively. The British ambassador, James Harris, described her as having a masculine mind, but also the weaknesses vulgarly attributed to her sex.
A typical assessment for the time, perhaps. Let's quickly touch on some key relationships. Poniatowski.
Stanisław August Poniatowski, a lover before she became empress. She later supported his election as king of Poland, which was complicated given her role in the partitions. They had a daughter, Anna Petrovna, who died young, legally Peter III's.
And Grigory Orlov.
He and his brothers were instrumental in the coup that brought her to power. She rewarded him handsomely. He was her lover for years, father of her illegitimate son, Alexei Babrinsky. But she didn't marry him, despite pressure. He wasn't really cut out for politics.
And Potemkin. Just how powerful was he?
Immensely powerful. Also involved in the coup. Became her lover, closest advisor, helped crush the Pugachev revolt, effectively ruled New Russia, the newly conquered southern territories, oversaw colonization, founded cities, encouraged university expansion. His death in 1791 was a huge blow to her.
Sounds like a towering figure in her reign. Okay, nearing the end of her life. Final months.
There were some disappointments. A plan for her granddaughter Alexandra to marry the King of Sweden fell through, which annoyed her. And there were persistent rumors she planned to bypass her son Paul and name her grandson Alexander as her heir.
Was that likely?
Hard to say for sure. Paul certainly believed it. But her death was quite sudden. November 1796.
How did it happen?
Apparently she rose early, had coffee, worked on papers, seemed fine. Told her maid she'd slept well. But later that morning she was found collapsed on the floor. Purplish face, weak pulse, shallow breathing. Doctors diagnosed a stroke. She fell into a coma and died the following evening. An autopsy confirmed stroke.
So relatively peaceful end, medically speaking. But the rumors?
Oh, the rumors were wild. The most famous and completely baseless, one involves bestiality with a horse.
Right, that absurd story. Where did that even come from?
Mostly anti-Russian satire, popular in France and Britain at the time. It built on existing negative stereotypes. Absolutely no historical basis. Just propaganda.
Good to clarify that. Her will had specific instructions.
Yes, about wearing a white dress, a golden crown with her name on it. 6 months of mourning. Her funeral was elaborate, lying in state for 6 weeks.
And her children, just to recap.
Paul, her successor. Officially Peter III's son, though Catherine hinted otherwise about Saltykov. Anna Petrovna, the daughter who died young, possibly Poniatowski's. Alexei Babrinsky, her acknowledged illegitimate son with Grigory Orlov. And there's speculation about another illegitimate child, Elizabeth Temkina, possibly with Potemkin, but that's considered unlikely by most historians.
A complex family picture. And her title, she was known as.
Her full official title was incredibly long, listing all her territories. But she was often called Mother of the Fatherland, or affectionately, Matushka, Little Mother by Russians.
Matushka, Catherine. Okay, so to wrap up, what's the big picture?
Well, Catherine the Great is undeniably a transformative figure. Massively expanded Russia's territory and influence, embraced Enlightenment ideals, at least selectively, while holding on to absolute autocratic power, and crucially, relied on the institution of serfdom.
A reign full of contradiction.
Absolutely. Progressive reforms alongside brutal oppression. Patronage of arts and intellect alongside censorship. Expansionist policies that both strengthened and, arguably, in some ways, weakened Russia long-term. A fascinating mix.
So as you've delved into these sources with us, maybe consider those inherent contradictions. This idea of an enlightened despot, a powerful woman navigating a man's world, a modernizer who depended on forced labor. How did these tensions shape her legacy? Why do we still debate her impact today? What single aspect of her rule do you personally find the most compelling or maybe the most contradictory?
Lots to think about there.
Definitely. That's your point of reflection as we conclude this deep dive into the life and reign of Catherine the Great. Thanks for exploring this fascinating historical figure with us.